Afternoon, everyone in the room and watching online. It's so great to welcome you to this event. I think it'll be very exciting. A wonderful conversation with Jasmine Tyler and James Forman. My name is Michael Satin. I'm an attorney here at Miller and Chevalier and also on the board of the Justice Policy Institute. So let me just give a brief intro before I turn it over to these guys. So Jasmine Tyler here to my right is a lifelong advocate and tireless advocate for criminal justice reform, also a public policy expert. She is currently the executive director of JPI, the Justice Policy Institute. She has worked in a number of organizations involved in justice reform at, let's see, the Human Rights Watch, Drug Policy Alliance, Open Society Foundations. She's been involved in all of the major sort of efforts legislatively at the local level, the state level, the national level, and even involved in international treaties. So we have a true sort of criminal justice reform expert here with us. And she'll be in conversation with James Forman, who is the co-editor of this great book, Dismantling Mass Incarceration. I say great book. I haven't read it because it just came out like a few days ago, but I have no doubt it is great. James is the Skelly Wright Professor of Law at Yale Law School. Some of you may remember him, some of the MNCers in the room, because he gave a talk in this very room about his previous book, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America, which won the Pulitzer-prize in 2017 or 18. Also a real expert in his field. But most impressively of all about these two individuals, that they are both alums of the two greatest institutions in the world, Brown University and the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia. And I have separately, which just full disclosure, shockingly, I know that I am also an alum of those two great institutions. And I separately met both of them in 1997. So if you'll indulge me for just a quick minute, I met James in 1997 because my college professor put me in touch with James when he was a staff attorney at PDS. And I was looking for something to do. And he said, why don't you go work as an intern investigator for James? I had no idea who James was. I met him on the very first day. He gave me two things. Still remember this: a collection of articles to read, foreboding his life in academia. So I thought I was going to be immediately going out in the field to investigate. And he gave me stuff to read. And he also gave me a beeper. Some people in the room may not know what a beeper is. It's this little device, and they call you on it, and it beeps. And then you're supposed to find a payphone and call them back. And that was the idea. And I had this beeper with me throughout the entire summer, not just when I was working, but like at night, at parties, wherever, just waiting for James to call. And he never called me until finally at the very end of the summer, he called me once. And it was when me and my co-investigator had kind of decided to go to Camden Yards to a baseball game. And that was when James decided to call me. And I hadn't told anyone we were going. But in any event, it was through James. I got to watch him in court, watch him in the jail with clients. And it was very, for me, a life-changing experience. It made me want to become a public defender, to want to do what I saw James doing. And so that was really sent me on the trajectory that I've been on ever since. So that was the summer of 1997. And that fall, I went back to Brown, and I was in a class with Jasmine Tyler at Brown, a sociology class with Professor Hillary Silver, political sociology. I would later learn that what I thought were my brilliant observations and really probing questions was really just quite annoying to everyone in the class. But at the time, I didn't know that. But anyway, 5 years later, I then started my career at PDS. My very first client, a juvenile with the initials JA, a 16-year-old, I was appointed to represent him. My very first client, actually, had the very same birthday as me, but born 10 years earlier. And Jasmine started at PDS a few months after that. And I was lucky enough to enlist her on the case representing JA, who liked the two of us so much. He was sort of a repeat customer of sorts and kept coming back for our legal services. But in all seriousness, he didn't ever go to jail. And it was because of Jasmine and the way she was able to convince the judge to not lock him up, and also to convince and kind of get involved in our client's life to kind of put him on a trajectory that ultimately, I believe, saved his life. So it is a real pleasure to introduce these two people that I have known for so long. And now, of course, they've gone on to do such great things, but you're all in for a real treat. So with that, I will turn it over to Jasmine and James. They're going to talk for, 45, 50 minutes. There'll be some questions at the end. If you're listening or watching online, just kind of mute yourself. And if you can mute your phones, and then we'll have questions and the like at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you to Miller and Chevalier. We are so thankful to be here. I'm so thankful to the JPI board. I'm so thankful to the JPI staff in the audience. And I'm so thankful to you, James, to be able to talk with you about this amazing book. I did read it, so I'm really looking forward, because I am also a nerd. So I'm really looking forward to diving in with you about this. So again, thank you so much for spending your time with us in, when you're very, very busy.
Thank you. Are these on? I got to turn it on. There's that thing. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Michael. And you might have annoyed your classmates at Brown. I can't speak to that, but you did not annoy us at the Public Defender Service. You were a phenomenal intern investigator, and I was so overjoyed years later when I saw that you decided to become a public defender yourself and have such a great career both there and now here. So thank you for all the work that you've done in the city for JA and so many other JAs, and thank you for bringing us to host this event. And Jasmine, it's a real honor to be in conversation with you. I mean, JPI, for those that don't know, I mean, JPI is an organization that has been producing. I mean, I first met JPI as a policy organization for their reports that they produced in 20, 25 years ago, documenting things that nobody else was documenting the way in which, even when crime was declining, media coverage about crime would be increasing, documenting the way that Black people are overrepresented as defendants in the media image and underrepresented as victims, documenting the racial disparities in the juvenile system. I mean, JPI has been doing this work for a long, long time, and it's so exciting for me now in this new era for JPI to be in conversation with somebody like Jasmine, who is a Black woman whose family and herself has been directly impacted by this system. And so she enters into this work in a very particular and special kind of way. And she brings a knowledge base that not everybody is going to have into the conversation. And she just, as you'll see in the conversation, undoubtedly, she brings a combination of kind of intelligence and also just kind of fierce commitment to justice and to truth. And so it's great to be doing this.
I just want to take a second and center us. And I found one of the paragraphs from the foreword very profound. So I just want to read you and Premal and Maria's words. Thank you. And it'll just help to center all of us, I think, for this conversation. And if you have the book, it's on page 16 of the introduction. It's at the bottom. We jail hundreds of thousands of people only because they are too poor to post money bail. We imprison thousands more in solitary confinement conditions that the United Nations considers torture. Once a person is released from prison, instead of welcoming them home, we stigmatize and exclude them by making it difficult for them to find a job or a place to live. And as some reforms are implemented, the system expands in new ways. Cameras and monitors create a web of surveillance that can feel like its own sort of incarceration. All this policing and punishment requires an enormous bureaucracy. The 2.8 million people employed in our criminal justice system make up over 1.5% of the American workforce. By contrast, less than 1% of Americans are employed manufacturing cars. And that really stuck with me in setting the tone for what is an amazing compendium of articles that some of you may have already read and remember, and others that have been sourced to really weave this story for this handbook. You call it a handbook. So do you want to talk a little bit more about how this idea came to pass and how you brought it to bear on it for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jasmine mentioned if you have the book. If you have the book, great. If you don't have the book and you want to purchase the book, I will be signing copies out in the hallway after the event. And there's also, if you have to leave for any reason before I do that, next to the book, there are some cards, some beautiful cards made by the graphic designers here at Miller. You can pick up one of those cards and then you just use the QR code on the card, which will take you directly to the Politics and Prose bookstore link. So lots of ways to get your hands on a copy. Yeah, so I appreciate you opening with that paragraph. And that paragraph in the introduction is a part of the introduction where we are talking about, how bad things still are. This is a handbook, and crucially, it's a handbook for change, right? So it's called Dismantling Mass Incarceration, a handbook for change. And the idea, each of the three of us had somewhat different, rationales for why we wanted to work on this. But for me, the principal reason came out of my last book, right? So Michael mentioned, 7 years ago, Andy Wise, another attorney here at the firm, hosted me to have a conversation about locking up our own. And in that conversation, in this room, and in virtually every other time that I gave a book talk, one of the first questions that would come up from the audience was, what can we do about this? Like, you've described this terrible problem, things like the paragraph that Jasmine just read. What can we do to respond? And what can regular individuals who are not part of the system, are not legal professionals, don't work in the criminal justice bureaucracy, aren't part of the 2.8 million? And also, what about us who are part of that? What can we do to make this system less punitive, less punishing, more rehabilitative, more caring, more humane? And one of the things that's hard about writing a book is as soon as you finish it, there's things you realize you didn't include. And I knew, even when I was writing Locking Up Our Own, I knew that I had wanted to have more material in the book to respond to that question. Right? Even before I got it, it was a question I knew I was going to get. Right? Well, so what can we do? This is terrible. You've given us this historical analysis for how it came to be that way. But what can we do? But, one of the things, the challenges of writing a book is it's hard. A book has to have an arc, right? A book is it's ideas, but it's also stories. It's a piece of art in some sense, and so there's limits. You can't do everything that you want to do, or if you do put in everything that you want to put in, then it becomes an unreadable book that only other academics and maybe your mom read. But if you want to write a book that is going to get a broader audience, you have to be careful about what not to include. So I couldn't fit it in, but I always knew I wanted to. So we sat down for this book to try to answer the question that those audience members had for me here and at everywhere else. Basically, this book is what I wanted to have in my hand 7 years ago when somebody raised their hand in this room and said, well, what can we do? This is the book that I wanted to be able to hand out, and now I can't.
No, it's really great. And it reads, for people who are interested, like for those of us who are practitioners, right, we can read the whole thing to think about the whole system, but we can also pick and choose, which I think is really critical in the work that we do, because it is so expansive, as you mentioned, that you can pick pieces that are closest to you, either that are happening in your locale, like wherever you're living, the jurisdiction that you live in, or that compel you to act and to get engaged. And so one of the other things that this book does that I'm so appreciative of, and I think people will get your goal from, is the fact that, like the Justice Policy Institute, you weave narratives like throughout, and you use narratives to highlight all of these examples of real thoughtful innovations that answer that reflexive question that people have, is like, well, what do you mean about abolition and defunding the police, right? And my answer to that is always, shifting the funding that had been taken from other systems back, right? And thinking about what it means to do the prevention in the way that we need to make safety a priority for everyone. If you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to pick up on, I think, kind of two parts of that question. One is a little bit about the organization of the book in terms of breaking it up. So when people say, well, what can I do, right? I want to do something. One of the challenges when you're talking about mass incarceration, right? You say mass incarceration and you say, 2.3 or 2.1 or million people in prison. And people who are not lawyers tend to think that there's like a system that has produced that, right? There's like an agency, there's a department of government that's in charge of that, right? But one of the things that lawyers know, and certainly people that practice in the criminal system know, is that although we call it a system, in a lot of ways, it's not a system. It's really more a collection of disparate actors, each of whom has lots of discretion, and each of whom has sort of internal logics, right, and history and culture and ways of operating. But that it's taken all together, it's all of those pieces that united have created mass incarceration. So if you're going to create change, right, if you're going to resist, if you're going to create something new, you have to break that system or non-system down into component parts. So that's what we tried to do. So the first chapter is on policing, right? Because that's the entry point into the system for most people. Then the next chapter is on prosecutors, right? After the police make an arrest, the office that decides whether that becomes a charge, right, is the prosecutor's office. Then the next chapter is on public defenders. That was obviously a chapter that was very near and dear to the three of us. All three of us, Premal, Maria, and myself, all worked at the Public Defender Service here in DC. So we all came into this work as public defenders. And then the next chapter, so you're assigned, you're a public defender. And then the next thing is court, right? Judges. So there's a chapter on courts and judges. And then the next chapter is on prisons, right? That's the next stage in the system. And then the last stage, which a lot of people who are not even people who are in the system sometimes don't think of this part, but it's life after prison or life after a criminal conviction, even if you did not go to prison, right? It's all of the web of exclusions and restrictions, some of them piled on by the government, some of them piled on by private employers or people that are renting houses, by private individuals and agencies that are outside of the government that can make life intolerable for people and can make your criminal conviction, which, we talk about, you 3 years, 5 years, probation, but it can become a lifetime sentence, right? So that's the last chapter. So, and in each of those 6, we try to present lots of examples of how, if you want to work in this space, okay, so you want to do something about policing your community, or maybe you're moved to get involved in the movement to try to elect a more reform-minded, more progressive-minded prosecutor. You name it, there are going to be ideas and examples of people doing interesting work in that space. Now, to get to the second part of your question, we also wanted in each of the chapters to present debates and conflicts and disagreements. So I don't want to have like 6 essays in each chapter that all say the same thing and that all agree with one another. I don't think that's interesting as a reader. And I don't think that helps anybody kind of figure out where they want to land and take a stand. So in each of the each of the chapters, in 4 in particular, there is kind of some sort of debate or disagreement. And one of the big ones is this debate over whether you should be thinking about abolishing the system, right, or reforming the system. And one of the things that I think comes out of some of the readings is that there's more overlap in those spaces than sometimes people understand, but they are different points of entry, right? So in the chapter on prisons, for example, the opening essay is one of those ones that's like, you know, there's some very recent stuff in here, and there's also like a couple just classics, right? And the opening essay of the prison chapter is one of the classics. It's an essay from Angela Davis's book, Our Prison. In DC, you always have to make clear, because in a lot of places you have to make clear, but especially in DC, this book, there's 2 Angela Davises in this book. And they are both fabulous. In this case, I'm talking about Angela Y. Davis from California, not Angela J. Davis here in DC. So Angela Y. Davis's contribution is making an argument that we should abolish prisons. And she says a lot of the time when we focus on reforms, we end up doing things that don't actually improve the situation, and we take away energy that could have been better used on the cause of abolition, right? So for her, there's a real tension between the 2 positions, which she tries to articulate. And then in the same chapter, we have examples of people who their work, you know, is by definition reformist. So tonight, I'm going to, at Politics and Prose, going to be in conversation with Clint Smith, the writer from The Atlantic, who also wrote How the Word Was Passed. Fabulous book, best-selling book. And he has an essay about Pell Grants in prison, right? And making the case for improving educational opportunities for people who are incarcerated. All right, well, here's the thing. If you're going to focus on educational opportunities for people in prison, that is reform. That is putting money into the system. You are putting money into the prison system. Now, in my opinion, you're putting money in the system for a great cause. I teach in prisons myself. I happen to believe very much in that. However, there is a kind of a tension between that choice, right, to focus your energy there, right, and to focus your energy on abolishing the system. I have my own point of view on where to land on that, which I've already given you the answer, because I told you I teach in prison, so I know where I stand on that. But the point in this reader was, we weren't trying to be, you know, we are not trying to tell the reader what to think. We're trying to present a range of different perspectives that are all under the umbrella of, we are working to resist and change this system, right? So there's not every viewpoint is presented, right? If you think we should have more prisons, if you think police should have a freer hand, right, to be more physically violent towards people that they arrest, Well, that's not in the book. So it's not all perspectives that are. You laugh. There's people that believe that. They're like right now. There's a national convention at which those ideas are being articulated. So not everything is presented, but within the context of people that say we want to resist, we want to create change, we want to dismantle mass incarceration, there are different ways of going about it. Sorry, that was a super long answer.
No, it's so great because, it reminds me of that Venn diagram where it's like you can have it fast, cheap, or good. And you can't have all three. And for me, while I also anchor as an abolitionist, I'm trained as a critical resistance abolitionist, actually, and I led that work here in DC a long, long time ago at the turn of the century. But
so where are you on education in prison?
Well, I teach in the DC jail too for the Georgetown Prison and Justice Initiative. So for me, I grew up visiting my dad at that jail. So in some ways it's sickening, but it's like being home or being with family when I go in there, even though it's a horrible, horrible place.
But do you feel like you're legitimizing the system?
We've had 17 deaths in the DC jail in as many months, and it's been really, really horrendous now, the conditions.
17 deaths?
Yes.
In 17 months?
Yes, and prior to that, there had been like maybe 3 or 5 in as many years. So we're in a crisis. The conversation in DC around the jail, despite the jail task force, which we were a part of, providing a myriad of recommendations for decarcerating. The plans are to move forward building a new annex that includes a multi-level parking structure and the new administrative offices. And you've been in that place. It's actually 1 year younger than I am. It was built a year after I was born. And so, you have a lot of ties to DC as well, right? I want to talk about some of our youth justice efforts that happen too. But when you hear that, it is hard, like you said, to reconcile going in those places. But for me, what's harder as an abolition is to ignore what's happening and not make it better while people are experiencing it. And to be that witness as well and to tell the story. So that's where it lands for me.
No, I those numbers are shocking. And I'm not familiar enough right now with what's happened in the last few months. I know that in a lot of places there's been some increases, but I haven't heard numbers like that anywhere else.
Yeah, and these are also a myriad of deaths, right? Preventable, violence, healthcare, substandard healthcare, which, has been a multi-decade issue for the DC Department of Corrections. In fact, my own father, some people know, almost died at Lorton in 1996. And that place closed just shortly, like 4 years later, finally. So this is not something that DC hasn't struggled with for a long time, and many other places, as you said. I'm curious, just not to get away from this book, but to bring in your past book, because you and I actually had some interactions back then. I was at OSF, and we had this conversation, and I'm not ashamed to say that I said, like, you can't put our business in Front Street like that. But now I have to say it's one of the most important books of this century. And I want to just be able to say that to you, having felt that caution before. Because just like this is specifically a handbook, but I think that's a cautionary tale for many of our current elected officials, especially Black electeds who rely on, big D funding and little d, like, that's not working. That was weird. But so I'm gonna stop.
No, I appreciate that. And that that book was hard to write because a lot of people, not many with your credibility, but a lot of people had some version of that concern, right? So that book is basically about how mass incarceration played out in Black communities, but with a particular focus on Black elected officials, Black judges, Black prosecutors, Black police chiefs. So it's really using DC in the 70s and 80s, but not just DC, other cities, Atlanta, Detroit, Oakland, Memphis, just to think about those police officers in Memphis a couple of years back. And it's really was sort of, it was pointing out that mass incarceration and the rise in our numbers in the prison system really took off in the 1970s. And during that time was also the time when in a number of cities, Black elected officials started to have some power and authority. And I was not making the argument, to be very clear, let me just say it, that there's like a causal connection between the two. I wasn't saying, oh, because Black people now had positions of authority, therefore the prison system rose. No, I wasn't saying that. But I was saying that those two things happen at the same time. Therefore, that gives us an opportunity to try to look at those places where there was Black political leadership and ask the question, well, what was happening in those, what was happening among those leaders, right? What were they going along with it? Were they resisting it? Was it over my dead body? You know, where were people? And that's the kind of the question of the book. And it came out of being at the Public Defender Service. I mean, one of the things that happens at the Public Defender Service is, you know, periodically there's some group of Black attorneys in the room and somebody has just come back from court where some Black judge or some Black prosecutor has done or said the most heinous, awful thing, giving your client the longest possible sentence, and then sometimes justified it on the grounds of their Blackness and the community. And they'll like, people would gather in a room and just be irate, right? And so those conversations were a lot for me, the motivation to try to really explore that history. And so I appreciate you saying that, you know, because to me, it's all about the execution, right? You can do that in a way that would be very damaging, and you'd come away thinking like, yeah, I told him not to do that. Or you can try to do it in a way, hopefully, that isn't, and that advances the conversation and really does point out some of the severe constraints that the Black political leadership was under, the fact that in many cases they were arguing for an all of the above kind of strategy. They were arguing for more money for job placement and more money for drug treatment and more money for schools and more money for mental health and more prisons and more police. They wanted all of those things, and what they got was the prisons and the police. So you try to, you know, I tried to, but I do think, to pick up on your point, it is a cautionary tale for right now in a place like Washington, D.C. or in other cities that, you know, D.C. is not, you know, for just, you know, demographically, DC is not as Black as it was in the 70s and 80s when I was really focusing my research. The first city council in Washington, D.C. that I spent a lot of time writing about in 1975, all but two of the members of that first city council were Black. So the city's changed in a lot of ways, but there still obviously is a significant Black political leadership in this city, and also kind of a history of leadership that people tie into. And I think that when, you know, when crime goes up, or when there's a particularly awful individual crime, right? Even if crime as a whole hasn't grown up, it is really incumbent upon people to look at the history and say, okay, we participated in some knee-jerk kind of responses, some things that felt like they were responding to the problem, but actually weren't, in a moment of fear and anxiety. Now we're in another moment of fear and anxiety, and the fear and the anxiety are real. Like, that's an important part of my story. It's not made up. When people say they're scared, like, they're scared, they're nervous, they're seeing things that are worrying them. And we can't dismiss that. We can't tell, oh, that's not real, you know? However, what we can talk to people about are, what do we know about what the evidence base for the kinds of responses that are going to actually promote public safety and do so in such a way that doesn't end up consigning a whole generation of people to incarceration and to the penitentiary, right? And now in 2024, we know a lot more than we did. You know, I always say, when I'm talking now to current electeds, I say, look, you know, in my book, there's a lot of sympathy towards some of these mayors and folks in like 78. Like, I have a lot of sympathy. You know, in fact, some people criticize me. They say I'm too sympathetic to that generation. Okay, fine, I'll accept that criticism. But what I say to somebody now is, you know, they had an excuse because they didn't know. But now, 40 years later, we do know. So that's what, and so, you know, just to take, you know, kind of like one example in the juvenile justice, since you mentioned wanting to talk about juvenile justice work.
Where DC.
Go ahead.
Where it's important to note too that DC has been a model in the past, right?
Yes.
So let's definitely talk about youth justice in DC.
Oh, yes. And also in other areas, right? With Second Chance, there's like my whole, so much that has happened in this city is positive since my book came out. So I want to honor and acknowledge that. But let me just give you an example in the juvenile justice space of like what has been learned versus, you know, in terms of effective responses. In the 90s, I know this because I talked to judges, anybody who practiced, you know, in the 80s, 90s will remember judges saying, when they were sentencing a young person or even making a detention decision, and you would try to present them with evidence of the harms, right, of Oak Hill back then. And they would say, look, counsel, I'm just not a life sentence. I'm not talking about 10 years. I'm not talking about 5 years. I'm talking about a few months to have them understand the consequences of what they've done and be able to make better choices next time. That was, I mean, if I had $1 for every time I heard that in juvenile court in DC in the 90s, you know, I don't know, I would have flown down here on my own plane. What we now know, the evidence is now just overwhelming, is that any amount of time in juvenile detention, being taken from your home, being locked up for a young person for any period of time, is harmful to individuals. It makes them less likely to graduate high school and more likely to be rearrested as an adult. So you can take people, researchers have studied, they've used jurisdictions where there's random assignment of judges and they control for every variable: race, criminal history, life circumstances, severity of this offense, and they compare two people. One of the two people got sent to a judge who locks up, who's just predisposed to locking young people up. The other person is sent to a judge who's predisposed, who's not inclined to lock people up. And they compare these two young people, but it's not just two, because it's them times 1,000. So you have a reliable data set. And they ask, okay, let's look 3 years later at all of the people who got locked up. And these are 30 to 45 days. This is not a decade. It's short. Let's look at those who got locked up versus those who didn't. Now, I wouldn't necessarily, going into the research, be sure of which group is going to show up with better outcomes over time. Because I could imagine, and this is the hypothesis that I encountered a lot, was, well, all right, they're running wild, right? Running and gunning, as the judges used to talk about. And now they got a timeout. They got a little, not again, 45 days, a little taste of what would come if they keep down that road. Got a chance to go to school, maybe, probably not a good school, but okay, but you know, something, there's maybe a book to be found. But that's not what happens. What the evidence shows is that the young people that are locked up, this is a study out of Chicago, but it's been replicated in other places, are 30% less likely to graduate high school and 40% more likely to be arrested as an adult. So we know that even a short period of incarceration for a young person, and this is because of there's different theories for why this is true. Some people think it's because of the stigmatization effect. Other people think it's the dislocation, being kind of ripped from your home, and then when you come back, you are now behind, you're behind in school. Everyone's like, well, where were you? Why were you there? Then you start to think of yourself as a jail kind of person. Everyone's calling you a jail person. Well, maybe then I should just be a jail person because that's what they're saying I'm supposed to be. All of these kinds of things, right, pile up. And then on the other hand, we now have a series of evidence-based alternative programs. There's a youth advocacy program out of Pennsylvania. There's multi-systemic therapy, which is being used nationwide. There's functional family therapy, which is being used nationwide. There's ROCA out of Boston. There's a long list now of programs that have been evaluated by researchers, which have the opposite effect of detention. That is to say, they increase the likelihood. So I'm not saying don't be worried about juvenile crime. Like, I'm not here with that position. I am here with the position that if we're worried about it, we actually know what we should do. And it's build up this set of alternatives so that they're available in our community for everybody who needs them, right? It's fund them adequately. One of the people that we include in the book is Patrick Sharkey. And one of the things that Sharkey says, right? And Sharkey has studied he's one of the people that has studied some of these programs that I was just talking about. And in one of his studies, he shows that for every 10 community anti-violence initiatives that developed in a city in the 1990s and 2000s, when a lot of these, right, when violence was high and people were responding, for every 10, you see a 9% reduction in crime in that community, right? It's a big deal. So what Sharkey says is, we need a massive commitment of resources, a massive demonstration project in a number of cities. I'm not talking about, because the way anything happens now, if there's any initiative, DC Council, otherwise, it's year-to-year grant funding. You never know if it's going to be renewed. So like the grant comes out, they announce the thing, the project gets going, but you don't.
Sometimes it comes out 1 month before you have to turn it in.
And you don't find out, and then it's due, it comes out in September, it's due to be renewed on June 1st, but you don't find out till May 15th if it's going to be renewed on June 1st. Well, imagine if you tried to run this law firm and you didn't know on May 15th if you were going to have funding to have any of your staff on June 1st. How would you ever keep anyone working? Satin, are you going to stay? Are you going to stay if you don't know on May 15th whether you're going to have a job on June 1st, or are you going to look for something else? So what Sharkey says is, no, I'm talking 10 years, guaranteed, long-term, big dollars, right? Let's make it so that the alternative programs we're talking about, which we have all this evidence of success for, are not only available if you get arrested on Thursday between 3 and 6 p.m. in this ward, right? Remember, I remember PDS, we were looking for alternative programs. We had this big book, and it was like, all right, well, this one is good if you live in this zip code and you have these charges and you're arrested on Monday. Then we have slots. And it's like, well, guess who doesn't operate like that? Guess who's open 24/7? Right? The police. And guess who's willing to file, guess who's available to file charges every day? The prosecutors. And guess what place always has beds? Has anybody who's ever been a public defender ever had a judge say, I really want to lock him up, but there's no bed space? Right? It's not a thing. But oh, I really want to give him this program, but there's no space. That's an everyday occurrence. So Sharkey is saying in the book, let's flip that. Let's flip that. Yeah.
I mean, at JPI, we work with young people all the time who are system involved. And in fact, we had a convening. These postcards are out front by the book. And these personas cards really exemplify what you said, is that, system involved young people have felt alienated and isolated and stigmatized and excluded and disappeared. And yet they are expected to be able to comport. And many of them have so many needs, particularly around economic conditions in DC, especially, and in many of the cities that you also mentioned. So it just reminds me that, we have been saying for so long, the Justice Policy Institute, a lot of other great organizations, that there are a myriad of solutions out there, and they really do anchor community safety when we are able to prioritize the other responses to, discord in our own lives and in our communities. So thank you for lifting up so many of those solutions and opportunities in this book and in your work. I think at this point we should take time for questions from the audience. Are there folks? Michael, are you going to do this? Great. Okay, here. Oh, he's going to bring it. Great.
Yeah, so if you have a question, just raise your hand. I can bring you the microphone to you. And I know there's some people online, and I'm going to be getting emails of them. So
great.
Thank you for this conversation. Okay, so let's unpack some of this.
Okay.
All right. Relative to abolition, the Citizen Project started a campaign this month, this year, 50 years in wake up. Right, talking about the mass incarceration started 50 years ago. So they doing a whole thing about abolition. But in your analysis, right, or some of the things you're talking about, how do you compare the fact that a lot of this is a social construct, that the system is saying that, okay, we're not really invested in reforming, because when you look at the prison industrial complex, so is everything is privatized. So how do you rationalize that, when you're dealing with the abolition, that it's gone beyond institutions, now it's a lot of corporate entities involved. How do you reconcile, or what have you looked at that in your analysis?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And so to me, one of the, just to go back to the Angela Davis essay, as much as possible, I'm trying to connect these things to, contributions which are in the book. And Angela Davis, one of the arguments that she makes is that prison has become so embedded in American society, so embedded in our consciousness, so embedded in one of the reasons why we have that number is so embedded in our economy. And to me, the point that you're also adding to that is this question of private entities. And I think when we think about private prisons, the main thing isn't, in my mind, prisons that are themselves privately run, although that is absolutely an issue. Mm-hmm. But it's that even in the public prisons, there's a lot of private industry that is providing, food and anything for commissary. I mean, that I live in Connecticut, which, prides itself, up in Connecticut, they like to sort of, they won't say this outright, but you can tell it's kind of on their mind that, that things there, is not as bad as in the South. It's not so bad as in, Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia, where I'm from. But as just an example of how that's often not true, Connecticut until last year had the highest cost to make a phone call to or from prison of any state in the country. It was like $10 for 3 minutes. Meanwhile, like my wife's family lives in Nigeria, you can call them on WhatsApp for free, right? So it's not a technology issue, right? It's a greed issue. And the point of the private industry point is that the more stakeholders you can get who are invested in the status quo, then the harder it is to disrupt the status quo. That's why the weapons, every time you read about any new plane that's being built or boat for the Navy, there's like jobs in 49 or 50 states for one boat. They make this part of the boat in this state, they make this part of the boat in well, why do they do it that way? Because they want there to be a political investment all over the country in the continuation of the weapons industry, right? That when the manufacturers are doing that, that's why they're doing that. So it's the same thing. You create political, it makes it more entrenched. So I think you're right that the privatization increases the challenge for us. But obviously, I think that the challenge is overcomable. And I get that motivation and that belief from not just the fact that there's been, a 15% decline, 20% decline in the prison population since its height, which is good, but still pretty small. But there are other areas where the drop has been much greater. So when I was in law school, one of the reasons that I ended up becoming a public defender is that a guy from Alabama named Brian Stevenson, who not a lot of people had heard of, came to talk about a case of a man that he was representing. Well, that case became the case of just mercy, and obviously Brian Stevenson is now won every award that there is to win and is portrayed by, Michael Jordan. Yeah, I was about to say Michael J. Fox, but that wasn't that's the wrong Michael. In the mid-90s, there were 350 death sentences being imposed every year in this country. And if you had said in 1996 that that number was going to be reduced 90%, I know I would have looked at you like, good luck with that. Like, I'm an optimistic person, but that's not going to happen. But that has happened. There's been a 90% reduction in the imposition of the death penalty in this country. Something that seemed completely entrenched. A lot of my students, so like, would you teach criminal law? Because there's still a thick section in in the criminal law casebook on the death penalty. Because like in the 80s and 90s, it was like a really big deal. And of course, it still remains a huge deal for the people who are subjected to it. It is absolutely an outrage. But advocacy and advocates did that. There's been an 80% reduction in the juvenile incarceration rate in this country since its peak. So there are pockets that we can look at and we can say, okay, again, still too high. Still, the new numbers still leads the world. Mm-hmm. But these are big changes that at the time when they were at their peak, people said would never go down.
Right, not possible. Yeah.
I am super excited to read your book, Professor Forman, Galen Boffman. And I have sort of a big question. I'm hoping it will tie together some of these themes, but just for a little bit of background from where I'm asking this question from. So I got locked up when I was a teenager. And that was 21 years ago. I'm still under law enforcement control. Mm. And I was in court last week. I had the opportunity to finally be free for the first time in my adult life. And I heard the prosecutor's office say that probation doesn't impact my life at all. And the judge made it sound like law enforcement control was some sort of accountability partner, was for my own good. And I think back to your story about Oak Hill and, let's send these kids to this awful place, and it's for their own good, right? Ultimately, it'll put them on the right path. And, I think about the theme about education in prison, and I can only imagine, I was afraid when Pell passed that judges are going to start sending guys to, for example, my friend Mark Howard, who teaches, inside the jail, just like Jasmine. Hi, Jasmine. That's an opportunity that these kids would never have otherwise, right? It's for their own good, right, Professor Forman? And so in my work as an advocate, I think a lot about what comes next and this dystopian shift that I've seen of law enforcement control justified as treatment. We even have 20 states in the federal government in this country have post-sentence civil confinement laws, which advocates like me call shadow prisons, where we can control people for their own good in therapeutic treatment. They're just prisons. And so are you scared of this shift like I am toward, oh, it's for your own good, at this paternalism?
Yeah, no, I am, and I appreciate you sharing your story, and I'm very sorry to hear both that you continue to have those restrictions and limitations, and also that they're not taken seriously. They're not even thought of as such because they are in your life. One of the things one of the essays that you might be interested in particular, we include an opinion, and this is in the last chapter, the chapter on, collateral consequences or life after prison. As there's opinion by a federal judge who catalogs all of the restrictions that the woman that he's about to sentence will be under by the very fact of her conviction. And he catalogs them in exhaustive detail. He actually asked both parties, the prosecutor's office and the federal prosecutor and the federal public defender, to write a memo documenting all of what they would be. And then he wrote an opinion in which he said, because of the severity of these restrictions, which she will have in some cases for 1 year, in some cases for 3, in some cases for 10, in some cases for life, I'm not going to impose a prison sentence because the very fact of the conviction and these punishments, that is punishment enough. And so that's an example of, I don't know, who was the person that said, oh, it doesn't have an impact. It's like, like send, we need to send a copy of that opinion to the attorney. But I do share your worry. And in my mind, as much as possible, the path forward that I'm really trying to push for is, as much as possible, whenever possible, to the extent possible, to the maximum extent, pushing as many things out of the jurisdiction of the criminal system as possible, so that the same opportunities, if it really is to help, then allow that help to exist outside of the criminal system. I mean, it used to drive me crazy, and every public defender knows the story of having clients who had addiction issues, and the wait lists for them when they were in the system, right? When this was as a condition of probation or condition of parole or pretrial services recommended, were long, right? They were long. But the wait list, if they were not in the system, if you won the case and there was no case at all, they're like, I still want the treatment. And then you drive with them to the clinic to try to get it signed up. I mean, you get laughed at. Like, yeah, come back. You put your name on it. You know, back then it was put your name on a physical list and, you know, we'll call you. When do you think? And, you know, I'm the lawyer. I'm not just going to walk away with that. I like need a little bit more, like, can you make a prediction? Like, how likely, you know, you know, and then you find out, yeah, it's probably about a year. So this is the problem, right? Is that the resources are too limited, and then those that exist are too often in the criminal system.
Here's a question from online, one of our online visitors, and the gist of the question is about DC politics and the focus on crime reduction, and the talking point that's being made a lot that we have too little accountability, and how you think about that. How do we increase the so-called, or at least address the criticism there's too little accountability in the system, and can you have accountability without necessarily having a more punitive system?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is I'm not persuaded that is true. Like, to me, too little accountability is a little bit like when people say, well, we have revolving door justice. Like, there's sort of terms that people use that I'm like, well, let me understand that and really understand what you mean by that. Like, what's an example of a person, you know, not being held accountable? But having said that, even if you take the frame of accountability, I think it's a mistake to think about, and I think that the people who write on restorative justice are particularly powerful on this topic. I mean, Danielle Sered's book, I would recommend to the person who asked the question. Danielle Sered is the founder of a program called Common Justice in New York, and it's a restorative justice program. And she has a chapter, I think it's called like On Accountability or something like that, pretty close. I think it's chapter 3. I've assigned it in the past. And it's very powerful, provocative book. And the argument that she makes is that our current criminal system imposes punishment in the name of accountability, but it actually produces a lot of punishment and very little accountability. And she contrasts that to restorative justice. So again, another PDS alum, Seema Gajwani, did really impressive restorative justice work in the Attorney General's office here in the juvenile justice space for a number of years. And the idea behind restorative justice, right, is that we're trying to look at, instead of asking who was the wrongdoer, who broke the law, and finding them and punishing them, we're asking, okay, what harm has been created? Who has been harmed? What would it take to respond to and redress that harm? And what obligations does the community, including the person that caused the harm, have in the process of redressing the harm? And Sered and Seema and others, I think, argue very powerfully. I can't do the argument complete justice in this limited time, but I'd be happy to be in further conversation. They make, I think, the argument very powerfully that restorative justice programs where you have to sit face to face with the person that you've harmed, where you have to take account for what you've done. You have to explain what you've done. You have to dwell in the harm that you've caused, and then you have to participate in community with people that want to help you, but also with people that aren't going to give you a free pass, coming up with strategies and approaches for how you're going to address that harm. They argue, and I think they're right, that that's much more accountability than our current system. What our current system does is it forces you to be punished, right? It forces you, if you go to prison or even outside of prison, this lifetime of punishments and exclusions from job and otherwise. So it forces those upon you, but that's not actually accountability.
For me, if I can just jump in, I like to take that question and turn it on its head, and I like to point to the accountability that's expected from the elected officials and systems officials to ensure that people don't have to come into contact with the criminal legal system and instead have their needs met. And we see, different crime rates and prevention solutions in other countries, including, countries with social nets that really create a baseline that help stabilize communities and ensure safety for everyone. And that's sort of, what's happening in many communities around the country, but not in heavily policed communities and communities of color.
Thank you so much for being here. This has been really wonderful to hear about. If it's okay, I want to turn back to the book for a second. And I want to ask Professor Forman, you mentioned in your last book that there were things that you had to cut because, you had to make the book readable. Is this the perfect book, or are there things that you left behind here? And, tell us about them.
Well, let me say that no co-authored book is going to be perfect to any of the individual authors, because everybody is going to have something that they wanted that they didn't get, or something that they got that they didn't want. And so, no, I mean,
Sounds like legislation.
Yeah. So no, I mean, it's definitely not the perfect book. So for example, and in terms of and cuts, so there are 2 chapters, for example, that I think would have been great to have that. And again, I think they were right not to have, just given that the book's already long enough. But there's not a chapter on juvenile justice, which we've been talking about. And there's not a chapter on parole. And those are huge, huge areas on parole that often get overlooked, that I really didn't want to overlook, but which are overlooked. So those kind of, in my mind, they stand out as like missing pieces for me.
If anybody is interested in looking into parole, JPI just recently published the first ever evaluation on Maryland's parole system in 100 years. And have been succeeding in getting some reforms moving forward in a really strong conversation around compassionate release and parole reform. And it's a big place that we should be focusing our long sentence work on.
As a bit of a follow-up to that, how much of the book, and as you're thinking about this, about political power? And I know you mentioned that there's a convention going on that's talking about things totally different. To the extent they're talking about these issues, they're going to grasp onto, abolition, defund the police. Those people are crazy. And if we're having this conversation about, Angela Davis on the one hand and sort of the more instrumentalist view on the other, to what extent is just the fight for political power so crucial to affecting these reforms?
No, that's a great question. And it's a good follow-up to Sheriffles, because that is an issue that we found very vexing throughout. I remember sitting down and we were talking, the 3 of us we've only met all in person over the 3 years of working on this book once. And it was when we were sitting down with our editor in New York, and we were asking him, like, do you think that we need a chapter on politics? Like, because so many of these issues are about, okay, so here's this interesting idea, but if you can't get it enacted, then it doesn't really matter how good it is as an idea. And we ultimately couldn't quite figure out a way to have kind of a chapter about that, but we did try to include essays within the book that have a politics kind of theme to them. So, for example, one of the essays that's in the chapter, it's in the chapter on police, but it's actually about sheriffs, which we don't talk about enough, but sheriffs are an area that can be, used for good or for ill, sheriff's offices. But this is a chapter about folks in New Orleans who decided to organize to get rid of their established elected sheriff, who was horrible in many, many ways, and to try to elect a more kind of progressive-minded, reform-minded alternative. Now, that's a kind of then turns out to be a complicated story in its own right, because the person that was elected has done some good things, but hasn't done all the things that they had hoped that she would do. But I do think the question of creating political power to enact some of the changes that we're talking about is a very, very important part. It comes up in the prosecutor's chapter as well, right? Another thing that I know that on the list of things, right? So I said the death penalty declining 90%, juvenile incarceration declining. On the list of things that if you had told me in the 90s was going to become a thing, that I would have said you are nuts, is this idea that people were going to run to become the prosecutor on a platform that said, we incarcerate too many people and we need to think about how to keep our community safe while incarcerating fewer. We should not be locking people up for low-level drug offenses. There are people in my community who are wrongfully convicted, and we're going to study cases and try to see whether anybody fits that. I know it's true nationally. Let me see if it's true in my community. There may even be people who were rightfully convicted, but whose sentences are too long. Actually, if we were to look at it today, we would say, you know what? That person shouldn't get. I represented somebody in DC in the public defender's office who got a 180-year sentence. And that was commonplace in the 90s, right? So if you had told me that people would be running on those platforms and winning, I would have said, no way. I'm an optimistic person, but that is impossible. But we have evidence in the room that such people exist. And so that's a political power story. And one of the ways it connects to one of the arguments in the books is a lot of times we look at the localism of our system as a problem. And in a lot of ways it is a problem. If I were creating a system from scratch, it wouldn't be anything like the system we have. But then we have to look for what are the opportunities that localism presents. And one of them is that in a lot of these sheriff elections, in a lot of these local prosecutor elections, not that many people vote. A lot of people don't even know the candidates. So if you decide to intelligently organize with other members of your community and you get a bunch of people who decide we are going to go to the polls on this issue, we're going to be single issue voters in this election, you can actually elect some people who will do some of the things that you want them to do.
And I think it's important too to pick up on this political power question, to remember, right, the 5 million people who have been disenfranchised or who are being brought back onto the rolls, and how important it is to get those voters activated and brought back in, right? Because they have experienced this, civil death, right? And what it means to make sure people understand that we are welcoming folks back. That reentry is the biggest component to this, because people have to come home. We have to welcome them home. They have to be viable and stay home. Thanks.
All right, I know there's more questions online. There's probably more people in the room with questions, but I think at some point we got to cut this off. But before we go, first of all, if you have more questions or want to hear more of this, James and his co-authors will be at Politics and Prose tonight at 7, I think. Yes. He's going to be outside in the hallway signing books, selling books. Jasmine's going to be somewhere milling about, so you can talk to her. Buy the book. You should donate money to Justice Policy Institute so it can continue doing its great work. Thank you all for being here, and we hope to continue the conversation. Thanks very much.